All right, welcome back to session 1, part 2. I got my laptop plugged it back in, so we're ready to go. So we left off talking about the different categories of law and the different types of law. So we talked about there are two categories, universal laws as well as conditional laws, and the different types within that. Now let's look at the next part of our syllabus here on page 6. Talk about the purpose of a law. So why were we given the law? Why did God give the law to his people? Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 to 25 says that the law was given as a tutor or to bring knowledge of our sin and our need for a Savior and for his grace. The word there in the Greek is pedagogos, and what he's talking about is this idea of like a tutor, a caretaker. And so the idea was that the law was meant to bring us to maturity and to an understanding. You know, when the law was first given, remember, it was given to a people who had just come out of a very pagan society in the Egyptians. They did not have a concept of God in his holiness and in his purity. And so all that they saw around them were those of the Egyptian gods. And so God had to give them an understanding of what it meant to live in such a way to represent his holiness. And so the law was given as a standard, but it was meant to bring them to this understanding of who he was. You know, when I was a child, I was, of course, disciplined like every child is, until as I got older, my discipline changed, because not that I grew out of spankings, but what happened is, as a kid, the laws were there to shape my understanding. And as I grew older, I became aware of and understood the reason for why the rules were there. It wasn't just don't do this, or it was to teach me what was right and what was wrong. The same thing with the law. It was given so that we would have an understanding of what is right and what is wrong. Not so that we would it was not there simply as a rules to obey or not to obey, but rather to bring us to an awareness of what is right and what is wrong and what God requires of us. This makes us aware of what is sin and what is not. Therefore, it makes us aware also of our need for a Savior. In fact, this is what the book of Romans is about, the whole first section of it, specifically chapter 7, where Paul says, the good that I want to do, I don't do, and the bad that I don't want to do, that is what I just keep on doing. And it is the law that makes us aware of our sin. And it brings us to that understanding of desperately need a Savior. And that's what brings us to maturity. So that was the purpose of a law. It also, some of your subpoints here, the Old Testament law, it expresses the expectations of relationship with God and what it means to be his chosen people. The word chosen people is that word set apart, and it's the word holy in the Hebrew, right? The word holy means to be set apart for special purpose. That's the basis of the word holy. So he says, you are a chosen people. In other words, I've taken you out of the situation that you're in, and I am placing you into a new relationship with me, a new society, a new family, a new way of doing things, and a new way of relating. And so that is what it means to be set apart, to live life differently. And the law was given to define what that looks like. The Ten Commandments are the kind of the basis of the law, and the first 4 of those refer to our relationship with God, how we relate to God, and the rest of them are about how we relate with one another. And so Jesus summarized all of it by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you do those 2 things, if you love God with all your heart, you're not going to break the first 4 commandments. And if you love others as yourself, then you're not going to treat them poorly. Therefore, you will uphold the rest of the 10 commandments. And so the 10 commandments is not the whole of the law, but it shows that how we are to relate to God and to each other. Then the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, and even Deuteronomy, and the retelling of the law, lists the outcomes of that, what that looks like in day-to-day lives and how it looks like in our worship and so on, as we will get into this morning. That summarizes the law, and also the Pentateuch portion introduction. So let's get into the actual books of the Old Testament. And we're going to take some time to go through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, hopefully within this session here. Now, the name Genesis means beginnings. It means the source, the origin, the start. The theme throughout the book of Genesis is about origins or about beginnings. It talks about the beginnings of the world, right? The universe. It was created. The earth was created. All living things were created. We see that in chapters 1 and 2. It talks about the beginning of humanity, right? The beginning of sin is defined right there in chapter 3, how sin came to be. And then talks about God's plan for redemption and how he plans to redeem his people from that sin. And then how that gets more specific as God chooses a person and nation out of the rest of the world, and he chooses Abraham and his descendants as the chosen people. And so you see there's the beginnings of all of these things: creation, sin, and God's chosen people. All of those begin in the book of Genesis. So let's look at the big picture view of the content. And again, we're just going to kind of summarize all over this, and we may drill down in a couple places. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 refers to, or is a story of creation. Now, the genre, remember we spoke about this in our previous lesson, is that the genre is the type of literature. And interestingly, while Genesis is generally a historical narrative, right, it's telling history as it happened. However, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are written in a different genre. It's poetry. In fact, the specific type of poetry is called a myth. Now, when we hear the word myth, we often think of myth as a false or fake or fabricated story, right? Some fantastical idea, some Aesop fable. But that's not what the word myth actually means. The word myth actually means origin story. Every culture has an origin story, and we call that a myth. And so don't mistake that as being untrue. But what it does mean is that it's a specific type of genre. And it's a poetic form of chapter 1. If you read through it in the Hebrew, you will see how it is structured. On this day, God spoke, and this happened, right? And then there's this cause and this effect. And so the bottom line of chapter 1, I think that we need to take home, is that Moses was not intending to write a scientific textbook on the origins of the universe. That is not his aim. His goal was not to explain the intricate details of how God created it in 6 days and how that all looked. That was not his purpose. And so much confusion has come surrounding chapter 1 of Genesis because people have taken this as a very literal 6 days, as very literal, this is how it happened. When you think about it, that was not Moses' aim. His aim was not to give a scientific explanation. His aim was into poetic form to explain and communicate these truths. Number one, that God created everything by his own power. So everything in its complexity and in its diversity was created by the triune God. And nothing aided him. He did not use anything. He created it ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. He created all of it on his own. That is the point of Genesis chapter 1. Now, many people get caught up with the days, and God created in 6 literal days. I think we get caught up in the wrong things. And I've heard and read many different scholars from many different approaches. Some that hold to a literal 6-day creation, some that hold to a more general, that God created everything in a period of time, but it could have all been in one day, could have been at one moment. God could have spoken and everything could have existed. And so we should not get caught up on those particular details because that is not the aim and point that Moses is trying to make. What he's trying to communicate is that God created the world. And I believe that we can agree on that God created the world in its complexity and in its diversity and nothing aided him in the creation of the world. It was by his design and by his power. So, before you get into arguments or debates about creation, remember the genre. And the one thing that we can all agree on is that God created the world and everything in it. Now, in this creation story, there is the first 5 days God created all the different aspects of creation. And then we come to the sixth day where God creates Adam. And what's interesting is that God didn't create Adam first, right? So that he was there to aid and help to create everything. But rather, God brought Adam into a already complete, functioning, healthy, nourishing system. That God provided for Adam everything that he needed. And so God created Adam. Now, Adam's creation was different, of course, than the rest of creation, where God spoke and it was. Whereas when God created Adam, he was very specific. And he said, let us make man in our own image. And so God fashioned man with his hands. Different than the rest of creation. Now the word there, when it says that God created, when God says, let us make man in our own image, that word image is an interesting word. It's the word tselem. And the word there is translated in the rest of the Old Testament and in ancient Near Eastern texts as the word for idol, like as in to worship an idol. And so God says, let us make man in our own image. In other words, let us make man an idol. Now that seems very heretical, doesn't it? And you probably hear that and you're saying, what? That doesn't make sense. But let me unpack that, because you and I have this understanding of what the word idol means. And we have all of the negative connotations that are attached to that word, idol, tselem. As in, God says, do not worship any other God. You may not make any graven image, right? You may not worship any idols. And it was the idols, of course, that caused Israel to continually stumble into sin. And so when we hear God saying, let us make man as an idol, that may sound very heretical and hypocritical of God. But let me explain what that word means. The word was understood to mean as a representative. So, for example, if you worshipped a God and you wanted to worship him, well, you can't see him. So what you would do is we would fashion a idol, and that would be the representative. That would represent God to you. We also talk about this because we use these things, right, called cell phones. And we know that we can talk on the phone to people. And that voice that we're hearing coming through our phone is not the actual person, right? It is a digital remastering of that voice that's sent over airwaves and then retransmitted into audio waves so I can hear it. And so it represents that person, but it's not the actual voice. For example, if I spoke with my mother this morning on the phone, then I would not have actually spoken to her, right? Rather, but the phone acted as a representative, and so that it was not her actual voice, but a representation of the voice. Does that make sense? So we understand that. In fact, even looking in a mirror, right? That's not me in the mirror. It's a representation in the mirror, right? It's something that represents. So that's how the first people who in the ancient Near East understood the word, as a representative. So when God uses the word of us and says, let us make man in our own image, what he's saying is we want to make man as our representatives on earth, so that all mankind will see man as representing me. And God specifically says that you are to represent me to creation, to the rest of creation, as you steward and take care of creation. And that's what that word is about. They are to rule over. You are to steward. You are to act as my representative to the creation. That is our role. That is the significance of why God created man, is that we, created in God's image, are to represent him on earth by caring for the earth and for others as he would. That we represent him. It is an assignment that we have to represent God on earth. That's a very high assignment. And what sin did is distorted that image. It distorted that. So rather than us caring for others, we begin to exploit. Sin twisted our assignment that God gave us to steward and care for the earth. And so that's what it means that we are created in God's image. The last thing that's created is on the seventh day is Sabbath. We must not think that God was tired, and so after 6 days of just laboring really hard, he decided to rest. It was actually a very intentional thing that God did. He created rest. He didn't simply just stop working. He created and built it into creation. In fact, everything in creation needs a rest. Take the soil, for example. If you're a farmer, you're planting, then every year there's more nutrients that are taken up in the plants, and eventually the ground becomes infertile. And so it needs to rest. And as it rests, it regains those nutrients in the soil that it needs for producing crops. So even our land needs rest. We need rest for our land. Our bodies need rest. We sleep most of our lives away. And that's not wasteful. That's created. It's designed. God created us for rest. And you and I know that if we don't get sufficient rest, we don't function as we should. Animals need rest. Animals hibernate, right? Oceans need rest to replenish the fish population. Everything in creation needs rest. And God created it and designed that. And he created us to take a rest, not just physically, but spiritually. But it's something that we overlooked today, I think, more than ever. It's because we live in these busy cultures, right? We live in this a busy time where we're constantly hurrying. And God's point of creating Sabbath is say, stop hurrying, stop and rest. What a Sabbath is a rest. It's a stopping from your normal routine. It's pulling back and not continuing with the normal work. It says 6 days you can work, but on the seventh day, that's for the Lord. That is to rest. That is for you to be recharged and refreshed. If you go through your day and you're busy running around and going from one appointment to another and from this thing to that, and then you fill up your day, what happens at the end of the day? You're exhausted, aren't you? Absolutely exhausted. But what do? We exhaust and we run ourselves right until the 11th hour. Then we crash in our beds. We have a restless sleep. We wake up and we do it all again. And we are not giving ourselves spiritual rest. We need to take the time to rest spiritually. Now, I don't know what your situation is. As a pastor, full-time, is part of what's built into my work week is that I get to take a 24-hour period of time to actually rest. And that's something that needs to be guarded and kept sacred, because it's so easy to take that day and begin to fill it up with all of the to-dos that we haven't been able to do. And we begin running errands and trying to get things done and accomplished, and that is not resting. And you might make the excuse, well, I'm not doing my normal stuff. I'm doing this other stuff. But we need to stop and rest and decompress. Breathe in. Breathe out. Be in the Word. Be refreshed. Take time to worship. Just take time. Now, I have the ability to build that into my week every week. I still have to fight for it. I have to contend for that rest, because if I don't, I fill it up. Naturally, I will fill it up with anything else that I can. It has to be an intentional time. In fact, during this time of COVID-19, we're recording this in May of 2020, and right now we're in the middle of this pandemic. And one of the blessings, if I could say it this way, one of the blessings of COVID-19 is this intentional rest. We've had time to just be down, because we can't do our normal work. And so for the last almost 2 months, I think now, it's been time with my family, my wife, and my Lord. And you know what my temptation is? To fill it up. I'm researching how to do church online, right? I'm sure you're in the same boat, trying to figure out the best way to do live streaming, broadcasting of our church service and everything else. And so I found myself researching and looking. And I have to stop and say, wait a minute, this is a gift. God takes care of the details, but I just need to rest. And you know that is within that time of rest that God speaks, that He inspires, He refreshes. But we have to take that time to rest. So what I've done in the middle of this pandemic is taking an additional time to be with the Lord. So I take a day every week to be with, as my Sabbath. But we've decided, as my wife and I, to begin every morning in tithing our time to God. We're familiar with the concept of tithing our money. But we talked about what are our time. And not just at the end of the day when we're tired, right? But at the beginning of the day. So we've intentionally carved out a period of time in the morning that was considered a tithe of our time, where we just spend time with the Lord and we Sabbath. We read the Word together, we pray together, and then we just sit in quietness and stillness before our kids wake up and the pandemonium begins. We just sit in that silence, in gratitude, in worship, and that is what fuels the rest of our day. So I don't know if you have the ability to do that, because perhaps you are a bivocational pastor and you're working a job or two jobs, and in addition to that, you are taking time to preach, and maybe you don't feel like you have the time. And maybe even taking this course right now has been like, how am I going to fit this into everything I'm doing? And if that's your situation, then there's still time to Sabbath rest. It just means you have to be intentional about it. Because if you're not intentional about taking the rest, let me tell you, you will begin to run on empty. And when you run on empty, you will burn out. So my heartfelt plead to you is, if you are not taking a Sabbath rest, maybe stop the video right now, pause it, get away for a minute, take a couple minutes and talk to Jesus about how you can build into your life some type of time where you can get away. Because what happens is, when we do not take a Sabbath rest, when we don't do that, you know what we're saying? God, I don't need you. I can do this on my own. Because God gave us a Sabbath rest so we would rest in Him and trust in Him, in His strength, in His power, in His refreshing and empowering. And what we're saying is, no, I need to do this on my own. I don't need you. And we are rejecting Him. It's a very serious thing. In fact, that's the whole reason why the Israelites went into the Babylonian captivity, is because they neglected rest. When we neglect rest, it's like neglecting the tithe. It hurts us spiritually. So just find some time. Maybe now pause the video and get away and just pray and say, God, I need to give you my time. Help me to identify how I can do that so that I can spend time with you. Let's look at Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 to 5 defines the fall of man and its consequences. So the fall, of course, changes everything. And the sacred story culminates in Jesus reversing the damage that was done through the invitation of sin into the world, through His incarnation. He came in flesh, in perfect, pure, holy, sinless life, so that He could be the sacrificial death for our sins, and by His resurrection to bring new life. Now, sin entered the world with a choice. And this is very significant, because if you think about it, there was Adam and Eve living in the garden, and they had everything that they could ever want. A relationship with God. They had a one-to-one personal relationship. They walked, they talked with God. They had everything they needed for sustenance, for nourishment, for enjoyment and pleasure. Their lives were perfect. And God said, you can eat anything you want. But God placed a tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden that was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And He said, this one tree, don't eat of. Now, you know the Sunday school story about this, right? You know that Eve was tempted by the serpent. The serpent came and said, hey, taste this, eat it. And she ate it, and sin came. There's a couple of things that stand out to me within this story. And that is how it came to be. You see, Adam and Eve were content. They had everything they wanted. They did not want anything else. Think about this. They did not desire anything else. It wasn't until the serpent came along and started to whisper into Eve's ear and say, hey, guess what? This fruit, it's really good. And if you eat it, your eyes are going to be open and it's going to be good for you. And it says in Genesis chapter 3 that when the serpent said that, Eve looked at the fruit and it says that she saw that it was good. She wanted it. In other words, he tempted her. And he spoke into her a lie that aroused curiosity, which led to desire, which led to her trying it. Isn't that how Satan works? His scheme is the same today as it was in the garden. He has not changed. We are going through life, we're happy, we're content, we're with Jesus, and then Satan begins to whisper, but if you had this, and God's not letting you have that, but what if you had this thing, then you would be happy, then you would be, or it could be in other areas, if you did this thing or acted, then you would be effective, then you would be popular. He speaks these things into our hearts, and where we had no desire for that before, the moment that he speaks that, all of a sudden it begins to percolate in our hearts and our minds. Satan even tried it with Jesus. He said, look, you want this bread. You're so hungry. So take this rock and turn it into bread, and then you will be satisfied. Jesus was tempted in all the same ways that we are, but he was found without sin. And he said, absolutely not. I reject that word. Eve had a choice in the garden where she could have said, no, I reject that because I see God for who he is, and I walk with him. I see him as glorious. We have this relationship. Why would I do what he told me not to do? She had a choice to make. But she saw it and she thought, this is good, and she took it. Now, I believe that Adam was actually standing right there with her. I don't believe that Adam was actually off somewhere else hanging out with God and they were having a really heart-to-heart, and then Eve comes and says, hey, you should come and try this, and Adam was then led astray by his wife, or that he felt bad for her, that if I don't eat the fruit then she's going to be kicked out and not me, so I take one for the team. Actually, I believe that Adam was standing right there with her, that the moment that the serpent was speaking to Eve, Adam was there the whole time. And instead of being a man and speaking up and saying, no, Eve, don't listen to him. Come on, let's go. Let's go hang out with God. Yeah, I hear he's over in the garden there. Let's go hang out with him. No, Adam was right there, silent and complicit, because his heart was also being deceived. And so sin entered the world. And what happened is, as you know the story, but God came to the garden and said, hey, what's going on? And they said, well, we did this, we were ashamed. And then after pronouncing the curses, what did God do? He clothed them. It says he clothed them with animal skins. And what that means is that an animal had to die. In order to take a skin off of an animal, it has to be dead. For the very first sin, God made a sacrifice. And he sacrificed an animal and provided the skins for their bodies for clothing. And that initiates the sacrificial system, whereby from this point on, the covering, just as the animal clothes covered Adam and covered Eve, covered their shame, that God instituted the sacrificial system in where the blood of the animal that is killed covers spiritually over the sin of the person. And so they are considered paid for. That is considered ransomed. We call that the substitutionary atonement. The atonement means something that atones for the sin, something that pays for the sin. And a substitutionary means that it was a substitute. So where Adam and Eve did not pay immediately for their sin, the death that they were deserved, the animal took that sacrifice. The blood covered their sin. And so that begins the sacrificial system. But this, of course, was never God's intent. God did not create Adam and Eve so that they could kill the animals and cover their sin. But yet it was necessary that God loved mankind so much that instead of having immediate death, a physical death. God gave them this way to atone for and to cover their sin. And that carries through all of the rest of human history until Jesus Christ comes, of course, who becomes the spotless lamb, who was the one whose blood atones for the sin of the world. But that sacrificial system was actually introduced right here in the garden. As you read through Genesis, a couple of things stand out. One of them is that even after Adam and Eve, people began to move away from relationship with God further and further and further away. Until we get to Genesis chapter 6, and God says, man, I regret even making man. And so, of course, he sends the flood and makes a covenant, the first covenant in the Bible, with Noah. We call this the Noahic covenant. And the covenant that God made with Noah was that I will not destroy the earth with a flood ever again. And so he gave him a rainbow as a promise, as an eternal promise that God would never again flood the whole earth and destroy the whole earth like this again. Of course, after Noah, after God was angry with the world and he sent the flood to wipe out everyone except for Noah's family who stood by him. Even when he did that, and the one family group all believed in God, all honored God, right away, as soon as they get out of the boat, already there's sin, and already they begin to distance themselves from God. And it doesn't take long, read a couple more chapters along, and all of a sudden, almost the whole world, again, has lost understanding for who God is. They do not know him, nor do they care. We get to the Tower of Babel, as they build this monument to heaven so that they themselves, as mankind, could be like God. They wanted to attend to the heavens. And so finally God says, that's it. I'm going to choose one person, and I'm not going to destroy everybody else, but I'm going to make my covenant with one person, one family, one nation, and build one nation. And so he chooses Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, and you see it again in chapter 15 where he renews this covenant, God says, I am choosing you. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and all the nations in the world will be blessed through you. And of course, he's referring specifically to that blessing, specifically to Jesus Christ, who one day will come and who will bring salvation to the world, to the Jews and to the Gentiles. And so Abraham obeys. Of course, we read in Hebrews, and it talks about that because he heard God and he obeyed in faith, and he left his family, that it was credited to him as righteousness. And by faith, Abram, before he was Abraham, said, yes, I'm going to leave my family and follow God. And because of his obedience, God made a covenant with him and with his children. Now, of course, chapter 24 begins the Isaac cycle, but between that, and you know the story, of course, but is before Isaac's promised child comes, God takes his time. You see, God is never in a hurry as we are. And God always waits till it's just the right time. One of my, I love the books and the movies, The Lord of the Rings. And one of my favorite quotes is when, right at the beginning, Gandalf comes up and Frodo, in the movies I'm referring to, and Frodo runs up and he says, Gandalf, you're late. And Gandalf's response is, no, a wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to. And I feel like that is such a commentary on God. God is never late, nor is he early. He does things precisely when he means to. And so, in the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah, he says, I'm going to give you a child. But they didn't see it in their time frame, and so they got frustrated. And of course, you know the story, but eventually Sarah says, come, why don't you sleep with my handmaiden Hagar and produce a son, and that will be your heir. And so they took matters into their own hands. Let me tell you something. Whenever God makes a promise, let him fulfill it. Okay? He's really good at keeping his promises, and whenever we try to help him along, it never goes well for us. And in this particular case, Abraham follows along, and Ishmael is born. And of course, which makes Sarah jealous and angry and so on. And over the course of time, finally God says, this is not the child that I promised you. I'm going to give you a child of promise. And Isaac is eventually born. And this is a child of promise. And as soon as he is born, Sarah says, that's it. Let's get rid of Ishmael and Hagar, send them away. So Abraham reluctantly obeys, and he sends away his firstborn son, Ishmael, and his concubine, Hagar, and they are sent out into the desert to die. And of course, in that time, God says, listen, I'm going to renew my covenant with you because you are a descendant of Abraham, and I will watch over Ishmael. And meanwhile, God's favor and his promise rested on Isaac and his family. But what that created from Abraham were two nations. Ishmael became the father of the Arab nations. Isaac became the father of the Jewish nations, who today, if you look at it, you have Israel and the Middle East constantly at war. And this all goes back to one man's decision not to follow the promises of God. You may think the decisions I make in life aren't that consequential. Abraham made a decision. Maybe Hagar was good looking, and so he thought, hey, this is an opportunity for some pleasure. And in a moment he made a decision, and he followed along with an ill-conceived plan. And that decision has resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties and deaths. So, take this to heart. When God makes a promise, let him keep it. Don't try to take things into your own hands. It never goes well for you or for the people coming after you. So we see the next part of the story is the cycle of Isaac. Isaac has two children. Esau and Jacob are twins. Esau was born first. Isaac loved Esau, wanted his promise to rest on him. But just as God's promise did not rest on Abraham's firstborn Ishmael, but on Isaac, likewise, God chose Jacob over Esau. So God chose Jacob, of course, in the cycle of that. But what happens with Jacob, interestingly, is that God narrows down his covenant with him, and he renews it with Jacob. And he says, you will be a great nation. And he changes his name to Israel, meaning one who contends with God, because he wrestled with God in the garden. And so he says, you are Israel. And actually, I think that's very interesting, because if you look at the Hebrew nation, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, they are stubborn people. They are people who all through the Old Testament says, you thick, what does he call you, stiff-necked people, right? And God chose not the easiest people group to form a covenant with, but yet he chose them out of his love. And he says, I'm going to establish my covenant with you. And so Israel, Jacob's, whose name is changed to Israel, has sons, and those sons represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And that today is still what we identify as the tribes of Israel. And God renews his covenant with Jacob, Genesis chapter 28. And one of his children is Joseph. And Joseph is, of course, his favorite. But he should have learned his lesson, because his father favored Esau over him. You would think that he would have learned this lesson not to favor one child over another because it's hurtful, but yet he did. He favored Joseph, which led to him being sent into Egypt as a slave, as his brothers, you know the story again. Brothers sold him into slavery. But what that did is that it prepared God's people for the next chapter of their journey. See, there was a famine in the land, and because Joseph was sent into slavery, and through all of his adventures, I'll say it that way, in Egypt, of rising to prominence and falling from grace and then rising to prominence, eventually gets to the place where he could influence change of a nation, and prepares the ground for the safe arrival of his whole family his father and all of his brothers and their wives and everything else, as God brought them into Egypt to prepare them to re-enter Canaan. If they had remained in Canaan, they could have been overwhelmed, and they would have been overwhelmed by at least the religious practices of the Canaanites around them. But God brought them out into Egypt to prepare them. In a little bit maybe of an unorthodox ways, we'll look at see at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Remember that the people of Genesis have not yet received all the instruction that would follow. They don't have the law. They don't have God's standards, his 10 commandments. They don't have any of that. They don't have his moral laws before them. And so they are in a heartfelt will, try and follow after God without really having all of the standards before them. And so you look through the story of Genesis, and you look through how people related to each other, how Abraham lied about his wife being his sister, and you see how Joseph's brothers, how some of the things that went on with them. I'm trying to think of some of the stories. But if you look through the book of Genesis, you see a lot of immorality. And you see a lot of decisions that you say, how can someone who is saved, a follower of God, how can they behave in such a way? But you need to remember that Genesis is written as a historical narrative to tell you what happened, not what should have happened, right? It doesn't say, hey, it's not condoning the acts of Abraham or Isaac or even Jacob having a whole bunch of different wives and children from all of them. It's never condoning polygamy, or it does not condone slavery, none of that stuff. It simply tells you what happened. So bear that in mind as you're reading through the Old Testament, specifically through the book of Genesis before the giving of a law, that these people are not living with God's standards yet. And so understand that this is a historical narrative description, not a prescription saying this is how you ought to live. This is your first, next in your notes here, your syllabus is your student response that's required. This is assignment number 1. So you're going to take some time to write out here. If you have a digital copy, maybe write somewhere else separately, or if you can write here if it's printed or on Word, and write which of the patriarchs is your favorite and why. So think through the patriarchs list is just above you when it talks about the cycle of the patriarchs. And talk about which one is your favorite and why. All right, let's move now to the book of Exodus. Exodus. Now the name Exodus means exit, to exit out of, or departure. This is a story of how God led his people out of Egypt and into relationship with him as a nation that he is forming for his own. As he's leading them to the promised land, to take them back to the land that he had promised to give to Abraham. And so they're leading them back. One thing to consider is the reason why God brought them into Egypt. You think about it, they went in as a people roughly 70, right? And that would be Jacob and his sons, Joseph's brothers and their wives and their families. So they were roughly 70 people in all. And they come into Egypt. And now they're leaving 400 years later as about 1 million people. Could be more. A huge nation. That's what he took a small handful of people, brought them into this nation, preserved them, protected them, and you'll say, yeah, well, they were in slavery. But for all intents and purposes, God protected them. He planted them in a land that was outside of Egypt called Goshen, and there God kept them safe and preserved them and grew them as a nation so that he could give them his law, prepare them, and to come in as a force into the land of Canaan so they could inhabit all of the promised land that God gave them. So this was a place where God actually prepared them so that they could enter into the land of Canaan. If they had not, it would have been easy for them to just assimilate into the Canaanite cultures that were around them. But this way God brings them in force. The theme of Exodus is the consolidation of Israel as a politically and spiritually nation, as God's chosen people. That God formed them politically and spiritually. He gave them the law for government and civil responsibilities and how they are to relate to one another, and also gave them spiritual laws about how they are to conduct worship to Him, how they are to interact with God. And so He creates a people and in a system for His glory. Let's take a look at the big picture of the content. Exodus 1 begins with this statement that there was a Pharaoh who did not know about Joseph. So in these 400 years, the salvation that Joseph brought by preserving the grain and saving Israel from all of Egypt from famine was long forgotten. And over time, these people became jealous of them. And this is actually just kind of a side note. Common throughout the history of the Jews is that where the nations around them become jealous. Why? Because God blesses them. To this day, God has made a covenant with the people of Israel, and God blesses them. God blesses the Jewish people. And so here they are in Egypt, and everyone else is struggling, and they're flourishing. And that made, of course, the Egyptians jealous. And so what did they do? They brought them into slavery, into servitude. And they put them as slaves. And so during this part of the story, and of course the nation keeps growing, which is making the Egyptians more and more nervous, realizing that if they were to stand up, they had the power to overtake Egypt. And so they kept them in servitude. In fact, even killing off all the male children to keep the populations down. And it was during this time that God preserved Moses and brought him out. And God heard the cries of His people. In chapter 2, it says that He heard the cries and He was concerned for His people. And now it was time. It had gotten to the point where they were ready. And so God chose this Moses who was saved and brought out of and escaped from Egypt to lead His people out of Egypt. And so God reveals to Moses His name. As Moses is taking care of the sheep, God, the story of the burning bush, and God reveals His name. But He says to him, I want you to go into Egypt, and I want you to lead out my people. And Moses says, okay, if I do that, who will I say is sending me? Because the first thing that they're going to ask me is, okay, that's really nice. That's great that you're going to lead it. You want to lead people out of slavery, but who exactly is this God that you're talking about? What's His name? And so God reveals His covenant name. I am Yahweh. I am. I am who I am. I've always been. I am the self-existent, self-sufficient, all-supreme God. That everything in creation was created by me. I am the beginning. I am the end. I am. And that is His personal name, Yahweh. The interesting thing is, this is not the first place that His name is introduced. Moses writes the story, right? He wrote the Pentateuch, and he uses the name Yahweh when he refers to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. He refers to Yahweh and 2, and so Yahweh's name is used. What happens is, and I believe personally that Moses is very intentional, that the name Yahweh ceases being used in Egypt and then is re-revealed to Moses. Because what I think has happened here is that as God's people were brought into Egypt, they began to lose the understanding of who God was. As the people, even though God had set up a covenant with Abraham and so on over these 400 years, they had lost touch with the personal name of God. And they were in a land filled with all of these other Egyptian gods, and while they knew and believed God, their understanding of Him had grown distant. And so God says, I am the God who is with you. I am here. This is my personal name. It shows that He is a personal God. So Moses goes back, and then there are the 10 plagues, right? The stories of the 10 plagues. And Pharaoh, of course, refuses to release God's people. So God brings about 10 plagues. And every one of these plagues is significant in that he is directly countering the gods of the Egyptians. And I believe that he does this to show to his people and to the world that he is supreme. And so things like they worshipped the Nile as the source of life. So what does God do? He changes the water into blood, right? And he does that to show that he has supremacy over the Nile. They believe in Ra, the sun god. So what does God do? He blocks out the sun and says, I am supreme over all gods, over the crops. They had gods for everything. And so the crops, the cattle, and every part of it, every one of the plagues is significant because it counters some Egyptian god that they had. And they were a god that had worshipped many gods. They're a polytheistic, meaning many theists, many gods, a polytheistic nation. And God was saying, but I alone am over all of them. And of course, when you go through the rest of the Old Testament, constantly you hear that the other nations heard about what God had done to the Egyptians. And not just referring to the Red Sea incident, but to the 10 plagues and God's supremacy. So God was showing not only to his people, but all nations that he is supreme. And that his people would know that their God is the God, the only one, the I am, over everything. And that he is one. And so that is the purpose of the 10 plagues, is to show God's supremacy over all of the gods of Egypt and to communicate to his people that he alone is God, so that they would know who it is that they are worshiping when they go out into the desert and they meet with God. The last plague also institutes this thing called Passover. Passover might be the central, single most important part of Jewish culture. And because it remembers that God is their Savior and God is their deliverer. On the last plague, on the killing of the firstborn, God said, I'm going to come through, the angel of death will come and kill the firstborn of every household in all of Egypt. But for you, if you have a way out, this is reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, take an animal, and if you put the blood over the doorpost of your house, when the angel of death comes, it'll see the blood of that animal and say, this house has been covered. This family has been covered. And he will pass over that house to the next house and check. That's what the word pass over, because during the night, the Jewish people, the Hebrew nation, obeyed. They put the blood on the doorpost, and when the angel of death came, he passed over the houses. And so from that point on, through all of history, until, of course, when Jesus sits down at the Last Supper, and that's what they were doing, they're observing Passover. What they were doing is they were remembering that God has saved them from the past. That God, in Egypt, provided a way by the blood of the Lamb to bring salvation to their household. And so they would take the bread that was unleavened, showing that they had to move quickly out of Egypt because they didn't have time to rise. And they would drink the wine to remember the blood that was shed. And Jesus, of course, in the New Testament, sits at the Last Supper right before his sacrifice, and he says, do you remember how all of your lives you've been looking back and remembering God's deliverance in Egypt? He says, guess what? I am the one who brings ultimate deliverance, and I will lead my people into freedom, into salvation, freedom from bondage through my body, which is this bread, and my blood, which is this cup. And God redefined what Passover was for the Jews. As the people left Egypt, and they left Egypt, they get to the Red Sea. God, of course, brings them through the Red Sea by his miraculous power. At this particular point, the Hebrew nation has seen God do 10 incredible miracles, and he's preserved them and saved them through all of it. And then they have seen him lead them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. So they've seen his presence. They got to the Red Sea and they saw God save them, deliver them from the Egyptian army by parting the water so that they could walk across. And they saw the mighty hand of God. The very next thing that happens is they get to the waters of Mara that were bitter. And they say, why, God, why are you here to kill us? And God says, throw a stick into the water and it becomes pure. And then you go to the next story and they're saying, oh, we're hungry, we're thirsty. And so God provides water from a rock. God provides manna. God continually provides them. And then they get to Sinai. And they have already seen God provide all of these miracles. They've already seen him. They get to the Sinai and God says, I want to meet with you. And what do they say? No, we don't want to meet with you. We're too afraid. So Moses, why don't you go and meet with God? You be our representative. You be the one to go up the mountain. So Moses does. He goes up to the mountain and he meets with God. And God gives him the 10 Commandments. And he shows Moses what it is that he expects from his people. As my covenant people, this is what it means to follow me. This is what it means to be my people. This is what it means to be holy and to be set apart. And of course, as you know the story, in the midst of that, the Hebrew people down in the valley are saying, man, where is this Moses guy? Well, we don't know what happened to him, so we need to worship another God. We need to show something. Now remember we talked earlier about the word Tselem, image, right? And they're saying, who is this God who brought us out of Egypt? I don't know. We can't see him. And so what they did, of course, is they fashioned a golden calf. And they said, here he is. This is the one. This represents God. They weren't necessarily saying that golden calf was what brought them out of Egypt. What they're saying is we can't see him. We have no representation. Moses, the one who we sent to go and represent us, we don't know what had happened to him. So we're going to take this golden calf and so now we're going to worship him. But of course, the very first thing that Moses said, or that God said to Moses, you may not have any other gods before me. You may not make any graven image. And so because of that, they broke the very first commandments. And so God is furious and says, I'm going to wipe these people out. Moses heads down the mountain to see what's going on, carrying the tablets, and he sees what they have done, knowing that they have broken the first commandment. He is furious. He throws down, he breaks the tablets, and then he comes up to the people and he says, what you have done is evil in the sight of God, and there must be a consequence to this. And so what happens is that he says, okay, here's the line. And if you are for God, come on this side. And at that particular point, the Levites came and they stood alongside Moses and said, we are standing for the Lord. And so they were given a task, a test of obedience. And they said, okay, if you're with God, then there needs to be a punishment for this sin. So go throughout all the land with your sword and kill in your left and your right and without sparing. And they did. They were obedient without hesitation. And because of that, because of their obedience, God says, because of your zeal, I will be your inheritance. And you will be given special treatment as my people because of your zeal for my glory. And so God says, because of that, you and your tribe will serve before me forever. And what happens is the Levites, the tribe of Levites, they become the priests. And the next book that we're going to look at in just a few minutes is the book of Leviticus, which is the Levites who were the ones who were zealous for the glory of God, who obeyed him, and who stood for purity, are the ones who are to minister before the Lord in the tabernacle and in the temple. And so God set that up. And the 10 Commandments were given, and then we just looked at, and then the next was the giving of the ceremonial law, which gets further explained, kind of amplified throughout the book of Leviticus, how it is that they are supposed to worship God, and how they are to live in purity, and what that looks like. One of the things that we need to understand is that these laws is God showing his people what it looks like to be a nation that's set apart, to be holy. And after 400 years of living in a pagan nation and seeing those practices, that worship of those gods, all the things that were entailed, that God said, the way that we do things, the way that I do things, is vastly different. And they are going into the Canaanite cultures, into lands, and they're going to drive out the Canaanites. But the Canaanite religion was the most morally depraved in the ancient world. And you are going into a place that is morally depraved. You need to know what my standards are, so you know how you are to live. And the last thing that was given in Exodus is the tabernacle. Tabernacle was the place of worship, but more than that, it was the means for how to worship. So there were articles that were contained within the tabernacle, and each piece of furniture had spiritual significance, from the basin to the altar, to the Holy of Holies, and the showbread, and the incense, and the lamp. All of it has significance for worship, for how we are to worship God. Let's look at this next thing here, the student response required. Assignment number 2. Which of the 10 commandments do you feel is the most meaningful for you, and why? Let's take some time, read through Exodus chapter 20, talk about, look at the 10 commandments, and write out which ones feel meaningful to you and why. Perhaps a good way to answer this question is that right now in this season of life, as you read through that list, what are some things that God's challenging you with? Or what are some things that God is maybe inspiring you to do? Or what things kind of are touching your heart right now where you're at? And why? Now, remember, you don't have to share this with me. You're not going to share this with me. This is just for you. But please engage with this in a way that's meaningful for you. Okay, let's stop right here before we get into the book of Leviticus. And we will continue with that with our session 2 the next time that we get together.